Morning, everyone. And it is morning here in Santa Barbara. Another beautiful morning. I'm not sure how many people are back in town now or Goleta, but it's a perfect day here. So this is our first deep dive for a documentary today, and I just want to clarify something because people have been asking in the Q&A where are the deep dives. So why isn't this deep dive up? Well, because it is Monday morning and I am just recording it now. So, why didn't I record it earlier? Well, because the assignment wasn't, the assignment you had to be finished, everyone had to be finished their comments by 6 a.m. this morning. So now it's a little after 7. And I had already gone through a number of comments and I went through the rest of them this morning. I got up pretty early. So there's no way I could have done this earlier. Although, in fact, I did make the previous deep dive, the one we have on the reading, The Uninhabitable Earth. I actually made that yesterday. So I wasn't able to look at all the comments before I made it, but I wanted to get it up to avoid confusion, even though there's still a little confusion. So yeah, so we're starting with our documentaries, and it's kind of a little nostalgic for me because originally the way these documentaries worked in English 22, and this is going back a few years, is that class was 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and it was in the afternoon, and Friday afternoons used to be our film day, and everyone would come in and we would just watch a film. And originally that started in IV Theater 1, which held 500 people, and as this class got larger, we had to move it to Campbell Hall. But I made the mistake one year when we first started doing it of encouraging everyone to, if they wanted to, bring popcorn or anything they wanted to, and to think of it as kind of like Friday afternoon matinee, which people really liked, but the staff of IV Theater didn't like very much at all because apparently there was popcorn and stuff left all over the floor. And if you've ever been in a movie theater where they come in and clean up afterwards, well, yeah, the people in IV Theater 1 weren't happy that they had to do that. So, okay. So, 2 films this week, Before the Flood, the Leonardo DiCaprio film, and An Inconvenient Truth. I very much enjoyed your comments, so why don't I jump right in? And the goal here, just to be clear, because this is the first week that we have the regular setup for the week. And what I mean by that is last week you just had to watch 2 short little documentaries, which are my introduction to the climate and generation series, and then the first one. Not a lot to watch at all, but I wanted everyone to kind of start off with an easy load and to make the quizzes easier. And hopefully they did. But this week we have the regular load. So you'll notice when you got to the page for this week, number 2, that under lectures it said you had 4 lectures. Well, that's not entirely true. I mean, if you read that, you might have been a little crestfallen thinking you had 4 hours to look at. But in fact, you had the 2 short lectures, and they generally run 10 minutes or so. And then the one last time for The Uninhabitable Earth, and then this one. And these run about an hour each. So if you added all that up, that would be about 2 hours and 20 minutes or a little more. This has to be done this way. If you're still moaning you have to watch 2-hour-long lectures, keep in mind that this is the way it works at UCSB. What we have what are called contact hours. So to get a certain amount of credits for a course, you have to have a certain amount of contact hours. Now, normally that would translate into you having an actual section too, but because we had the films, we were able to work everything out with this. And sometimes these, what I'm doing, will be longer. So it's just to sort of replicate 3 50-minute sessions. So if you added that up, you would get, even a little more than we have right now, but some weeks it will be more and it'll balance out. So that's why I set up this way. And just so you know, every week will be set up the same exact way. So let me jump over and get right into our material. Deep dive. So I'm just going to go into these. And again, I pulled these out. They're not, always the most significant ones, but the ones that sort of caught my attention. And keep in mind, too, that I will be scrolling pretty quickly sometimes, even though I'm holding on this frame for a while. But I just wanted to let you know that sometimes you'll have to pause and go back to them and all. And let me see if do I take a whole lot of room if I pop on here? Yeah, probably. I'll pop off for now. Yeah, I enjoyed Before the Flood. made the whole thing more relatable with Leonardo DiCaprio. And let me just, I'll jump back and forth this way then. That is a really good point. Because Leonardo DiCaprio is not an expert. And I might have mentioned this in a previous video, but lecture, but it's really good to note it here. The rhetorical approach employed by the filmmakers here, and that would be Fisher Stevens, who is the director, and Leonardo DiCaprio and all, is to have someone who is not an expert. And the reason for that is you are sort of tagging along with Leo, and you are learning as he's learning. In the other film we watched this week, the Al Gore film, he is an expert. So I think it was very cleverly done to make it seem as if you're part of the experience and you're learning as he's learning. It is a rhetorical decision, however. Let me jump back. This person had another great point. Yeah, the satellite subplot was fun and all. It was fun because in a film about a topic that had let me see if I can quote this here, had a tendency to make me feel like I'm face down in the dirt with my hands tied behind me. Ah, wow. What a great image. And what a great way of kind of arguing why we're doing the deep dives, why we're doing it this way. In other words, I could have just had an hour-long lecture on these documentaries, and it could have just been me talking. I think this is more interesting. Well, it is just me talking, but I'm hearing your voices too, or we're hearing them by way of you watching them. And I would encourage you, of course, to read these and to read as many as you can when they're up on YouTube. And I suspect maybe you are doing that before you place a comment and all. But, you know, this image here, you know, I'll read it here, you know, face down in the dirt with my hands tied behind my back. Wow, what a great image. And it communicates to me what people are feeling. So already we got from the last one I did, deep dive on the uninhabitable earth, that people are feeling sad and helpless and frustrated. But, you know, this is just really expresses that in a perfect way. Hands down in the mud with your hands tied behind your back. That, you know, you're completely helpless in this situation. And me just continue with what that person says. Through this, I mean, through this, and that would be that image, I mean that it feels like no matter how much I want to fix the issue of climate change, I feel like my personal actions won't amount to enough to make a significant difference. I think that is an attitude that many people have. And I think, you know, we often talk about resistance to doing something with the climate crisis. We often focus on climate change deniers and all. And we're going to do that. We're going to see a little of that today even, but especially next week we're going to get into those folks. But I think a lot of people would want to do something, they don't know where to begin, they don't feel their personal actions are going to make much difference. And we're going to see a lot of personal actions coming up, by the way, in terms of, you know, foregoing eating beef in fast fashion and all. But you remember, hopefully you've all watched, I have one of the opening introductions I did, those videos, I talk about it. But there's more than just personal action. There's political action and there's collective activism. They all three are things that you can do and need to do. And I actually mentioned that there's a fourth thing in that lecture, just worth framing here, and that is technological change. You may be able to do that too. And what I mean by that is you might be, you know, a person who ultimately gets a degree that allows you to, you know, work with new technology, or you wouldn't even need a degree necessarily, but you certainly could, and you certainly could use your time here at UCSB and learn to do that. That's great. Most people can't do that. Most people can't figure out how to make a new, you know, lithium-ion battery or what that would be like, but maybe you can. But for everyone else, you can do personal action, and you can, you know, take part in collective activism, and you certainly become political active, even if it's just to vote, let alone, you know, you could do what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did when she was in her 20s, which is, you know, get elected to Congress. So the issue here is, though, people often feel that individual action doesn't make much difference, and that's true. If you were just one person, you were the only person on the planet who decided to forego eating beef because it would lower your methane, you know, emissions, yeah, that wouldn't make much difference. It would be imperceptible. But if enough people do it, and, you know, it can make a huge difference. In fact, that would be monumental. But we also have to look at these other factors, which we will throughout the term. So, yeah. Okay, let's jump to, let me jump down here to the next one. Documentary well put together, more impactful than the original film, An Inconvenient Truth. Right from the beginning, I was pulled into the film by voices of doubt and criticism toward Al Gore's efforts being played. Juxtaposition of these false words against the powerful images of realities of the climate crisis in the world played very well. So this is a good opportunity to mention An Inconvenient Sequel is a sequel to something. It was a 2006 film called An Inconvenient Truth. That was a monumental film. It was the first major climate change film. And it played in first-run theaters, so you could see this, in theaters. They were also playing, action films that, the next movie over. And a lot of people saw it. And as a consequence, Al Gore was awarded, along with 1,500 scientists who worked in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In 2007, Al Gore was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for it. It's interesting, and in part, I say that for the film, but to frame who Al Gore is, and I think there's a little confusion in one of the comments coming up, but I'll just say it here. Al Gore was the vice president during the Clinton administration. That was Bill Clinton from 1992 to the year 2000. Gore was the vice president of that administration and ran for president in the year 2000 against George W. Bush, who was the son of the George Bush who was the president before Bill Clinton. In 2000, it was a very close election. So people are talking about how the election is close now. Well, this election actually wasn't close. I mean, just if you read the actual statistics, it wasn't. But that 2000 election was very close, and it all hinged on Florida, on one state. And we, in fact, now know that Al Gore won the election. Al Gore should have been the president then, but he conceded it because he didn't want to put the country through the turmoil of having to feel that the election process was a problem. Wasn't that nice of Al Gore? Couldn't have other people have done that? In this case, he actually did win it, but it is interesting to think about because here's a guy who would a few years later become a Nobel laureate for his work on climate change, and he could have been our president, and it would have been very different than the president we had, insofar as George W. Bush was very closely affiliated with fossil fuel interests, as well as Dick Cheney, his vice president. Anyhow, Al Gore's involvement goes way back. So unlike Leonardo DiCaprio, whose main claim to fame here is, in fact, his fame, that's what he brings to the table, his audience, Al Gore had, in fact, known about the climate crisis since the 1960s. So when you hear people say we just didn't know, well, Al Gore learned about it. He happened to have a very knowledgeable professor when he was at school, which was at Harvard in the 1960s, and he actually talks about that in An Inconvenient Truth, the first film. And what happened was Gore was in the military for a while and then was in law school, and while in law school he decided to run for the U.S. Congress, kind of like AOC, very young, dropped out of law school, ran for the House of Representatives like AOC, and won. And one of the first things he did was to start talking about climate change and the fact that we needed to deal with it back in the 1970s. And he didn't get a whole lot of traction then, but he certainly worked hard at trying to do it. And ultimately, that came to fruition, I guess, with An Inconvenient Truth. And what this comment noted here was so good about that is Gore came under fire for that documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. Climate change deniers attacked him right and left. There was even a lawsuit brought against him in Europe, brought against the film in Europe, so that it couldn't be shown in schools. Deniers said that not everything he said was accurate. For example, in that film, he talks about Hurricane Katrina, which had just happened, and he talks about how the climate crisis would have been, climate change in the form of global temperature, and form of temperature rise over basically the Gulf of Mexico would have exacerbated that problem because it warmed up those waters, intensifying Hurricane Katrina. It was argued, even though scientists had put that forth, Gore didn't make it up himself, it was argued that that couldn't be proven at the time, and it was agreed that it couldn't by that particular court in Europe, as I recall, and it actually, the film had to be shown with the disclaimer saying that, well, that's not proven. Well, now I think everyone is of the opinion opinion, that's exactly what happens. The fact that we're having what are essentially Category 6 hurricanes at this point is proof in the pudding that it's happening. But at the time, it wasn't clearly known that it was. Gore became like the number one, I don't know how else to put it, adversary of climate change denial folks, mainly because he was so well known and so active and all, and he came under enormous personal attack, and still does. And it's just now we also have new punching bags for the it's a horrible way of putting it, but I don't know what else to say. They're just being kind of brutalized by it. And that would be people like AOC or even Greta Thunberg comes under attack. So when you pop your head up as a climate activist, and we even saw that, by the way, we'll get to before the flood in a minute, Leonardo DiCaprio, you hear at some points he's coming under attack. I think anyone who pops your head up as someone who believes in the climate crisis and willing to go public about it, even someone like Bill Nye, the science guy, who's out there, gets attacked. So and that's why when the person here noted that the juxtaposition of these false words against the powerful image and realities of the climate crisis in the world played very well. I think that was the idea here, to show the reality of the climate crisis, even though people are denying it. And it's hard to deny it when you look at the reality or see the reality, and that's something that film can bring to the table, which is why we're using film. So in a way, there's an overlap, or at least a dovetail, between the reading that we did this week for last week in Inconvenient, the reading we did, The Uninhabitable Earth, and the films we watched this week. But the films, I don't know, they sort of viscerally show it to you. We can't be there, but that's the point of the one we're going to get to next. We'll talk about in a couple of minutes. Before the flood, you actually go along to see it. It's about as close as you can get to being there by traveling along with Leo and his trip. So let's go to the next one. Inconvenient sequel chose the perspective that tracks me most, the political factor to criticizing environmental degradation and environmental protection measures in recent decades. However, I began to admire Mr. Gore for his efforts to combat environmental degradation and pollution. Because I wasn't born in a political background in the U.S., I'm not familiar with Mr. Gore's actions during his, I added their vice presidency, this presidency. So I wanted to clarify that he was not president. He should have been president. He was vice president, but yeah. And all during his vice presidency, of course, Gore was very active as part of that administration. So it was the Clinton administration. He was a vice president. Vice presidents aren't actually usually that active, compared to a president. But Gore was very active with respect to the climate crisis during the 8 years he held the vice presidency. So an incredibly interesting guy insofar he's been active now for so the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the aughts, this generation, the teens, and now he's still active in this generation. So it spans 6 generations. It's pretty amazing. This person notes that what attracted this person most is the political factor, and that is a factor here. And again, if you didn't know about this situation, you would assume it's just like a technological thing, like how can we solve this technologically? But again, politics are absolutely huge. And someone like Gore, who was a political activist fighting for a climate crisis, how different would it be if Gore had gotten in compared to someone like Donald Trump? By Trump's own, admission, he sort of wavered, he made a range of statements regarding the climate crisis, but perhaps the most famous is he said it's a hoax, but a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese and Chinese government. He just says the Chinese, but I assume he means Chinese government. And why would that happen? Well, according to him, the Chinese government was trying to get us in the U.S. to enact all this environmental legislation, and that would slow down our economy, because presumably it would mean that switching to renewable energy would cost a lot of money, and it would be, according to him, less efficient than fossil fuels and all. So when we spent all that money, China was trying to get us to do that, so that they couldn't, and they would rise ahead, surpass us on the world stage. It's an absolutely crazy idea, and it's racist and problematic. I mean, it's not funny. It's seriously a problem, and only because it's outrageously wrong. So, where was this effort made by China to do that? Well, There is no effort. There's no proof of it. It was never done. It was just some odd conspiracy theory that was cooked up. But anyhow, sorry, I'm not going to rant against the almost former President Donald Trump. But this is, as the person rightly noted here, a political issue, and a significant political issue. So let's move up here a little. Yeah, in an introductory video, Ken stated that the first few weeks of the class are undeniably depressing, and this could not be any more true. Yeah, just to clarify that, I wasn't just saying it. Now you know it's true, and you're really, at this point, this person had made the statement just 1 week in, and both with the reading and the films, it's already depressing, and it's going to get worse. I can tell you that now. So. I'm not sure if you're going to watch this first or you're going to watch the next documentary and read the next reading. It's up to you. But the reading and the documentary you have this week are going to be close to home. The reading is in Santa Barbara County and Ventura County principally, and the documentary is about the wildfires in California. So it gets even worse and more depressing. Yeah, so let me shift back here again. When reading The Uninhabitable Earth, I was completely shocked by the devastating future Wallace Wells illustrated through his readings. But after watching Before the Flood, my shock and fear had been cemented due to visuals the documentary provided on the devastation already happening. I find it completely devastating and corrupt how individuals and countries that contribute the least to the problem are the ones who are suffering the worst. As the world leader it claims to be, the United States should be taking charge and addressing the issue and investing in solutions. I just read that because it was so on in so many ways. So, yeah, so there's a difference between, even though both are depressing, as this person started off with, and rightly so, there's a difference between an Inconvenient or Before the Flood and the reading we read, The Uninhabitable Earth. Uninhabitable Earth, David Wallace Wells is looking to the future. Potential future, a future that would happen if we continue to have business as normal, which is the phrase. If business is normal and we don't do anything to stop this, and you can say, well, we're going to do something to stop it, we don't have to worry about that. Well, we need to worry about it because it has been business as normal for decades now. In the 7 decades that, that Al Gore has been active there, it's actually not 7, it's like 50 years, but in that period of time, we haven't done anything. Well, that's wrong. It's just me being depressed myself. We've done very little, and we haven't done nearly enough, put it that way. So we need to do something. But what he is showing us in Leonardo DiCaprio and the filmmakers in Before the Flood is in fact what is happening right now. So it's different than Wallace Wells. He's imagining what it could be if we don't do anything. Leo's gang are saying, well, this is what's happening right now. Let's go around the world and take a look to see what's happening. And again, I've stated before in videos already, even though it's just into the 2nd week now, that the question of when the climate crisis is going to start is a misguided one. The climate crisis is here. And that's what this person who made the comment found so compelling about Before the Flood, is you can see it's here. This is not speculation the way we had with, David Wallace Wells. So, the next thing that this person talked about is, I find it completely devastating and corrupt how individuals and countries that contribute the least to the problem are the ones who are suffering the worst, and alternately the ones like the U.S. That is the problem, and that is the issue, really, of climate justice on the table here. And, although the film wasn't specifically just about that, when Leonardo DiCaprio is in a place like India, and you see very poor farmers and the problems they have. And we're going to revisit farmers in India, by the way, in the documentary, The True Cost. And again, documentaries are so good, that one too, of showing their plight. But I've given this statistic before, and I'll give it again since it's so striking. The poorest 3 billion people on the planet, it's not quite half the world's population, but approaching it. The poorest 3 billion have only contributed 5% of the global greenhouse gases that are up there. Just 5%. When you look at what the developed world, when you look at so-called developed world, that would be like North America, the EU, a few other places like Japan and all, basically, in my lifetime, 2/3 of the greenhouse gases were put up there by that group. They have done the most, and they are doing the least to stop. They're not sufficiently acting to stop it. It's not entirely true, so I just mentioned in the blanket way the EU there and all. Some countries like Germany have really made major efforts. But when you look at the United States, and we kind of need to do that because, well, that's where we are, it's striking to think about. And it's really worth pausing on for a moment. Imagine how we seem to the rest of the world. Imagine for a moment that you're one of those folks that we met in India where you saw farmers' fields have been flooded and all. What must they think of us? But, especially we broadcast our lifestyle, and, we have this ideal of Cardassian lifestyle of excess and all, and we sell that image to the world, and the world, to the extent that they understand what's happening, and many, many people do, that's what's bringing about this problem. I mean, how unjust is that? I mean, that's why it's a social justice issue. It's why, people like me are involved in a field called climate justice, because that's outrageous. And again, this is different than what I talked about last time, the notion of point source pollution, where if you're emitting something out of your tailpipe, well, that carbon dioxide, the sulfur dioxide coming out that comes down as acid rain, that's generally going to be a pretty local, regional issue. I mean, it can move, when it gets high enough in the atmosphere, move over even across continents, but tends to be regional more so. But when it comes to CO2, it doesn't matter. I mean, we're emitting it now, and it affects the entire planet. So, yeah. Jump into the next one. Before the Flood does cover an immense amount of material. There's no doubt about it. Hold on one second. I see that it's getting a little light, so I just... Oh, hold on. I think I may have actually switched over to show you what I was doing. So if you saw what I was doing there, I was actually tweaking the photo settings on my camera, because as I'm recording this, it's getting brighter outside. So my camera I can control from what I think you just saw there, which was an app on the computer. So I was just changing the settings on it. So that's what that was. Covers a lot of material. It's a lot for the brain to comprehend without even thinking existentially. Leonardo DiCaprio travels the world as the UN messenger of peace. Yeah. It's interesting to think about, and why I put this comment here, that he was chosen by the United Nations. And he's an interesting person to have made this documentary for that reason. And what I mean by that is, well, Al Gore is kind of like a logical person, right? He knows the issue, and he's been working at it for decades. Maybe even more logical would have been a climate scientist, someone, and there are plenty of those out there, who knows the issue. But Leonardo DiCaprio, I think, was chosen for this idea that, he would be able to reach a large audience. And that's what this film was setting out to do. And I think, he was pretty successful in doing that. So I think it is interesting to think about who delivers the message, and that's an important point for us because, folks like me who do textual analysis and who study text and their context, one thing we think about is audience, and we really need to think about that here. Who is the audience of this film? And it's a broad audience, I think. And I think that's why you needed Leonardo DiCaprio to do it. So in other words, there are actually great documentaries out there, but I think most people haven't heard of them and wouldn't find them all that interesting, because they're not for everyone. They're for people who are really invested deeply in the issue and want to study it in greater detail. That's not the audience here, I think. The audience here are people who are curious about it, and by way of someone like Leonardo DiCaprio would have been drawn into it. So they would have seen that he was associated with it and watched it. And that way, I have to say, I whatever whatever else, I don't know much about Leonardo DiCaprio, I applaud him insofar as he's actually doing something with his platform, right? He has this celebrity and he's doing something with it. And I think there's so many influencers out there, and you've probably heard me say this before, I'll say it again. I am vexed by influencers who have huge audiences and millions of subscribers and social media, and they don't do anything with it. So Leonardo DiCaprio is trying to touch that other audience, which is why it's interesting to think about the fact that other influencers have different sorts of audiences, but could bring those audiences into a problem like this if they wanted to. Granted, they may not know a whole lot about it, but they could interview someone. I'm sure there are plenty of scientists who would be happy to talk to influencers who had literally hundreds of millions of subscribers on Instagram or whatever. Anyhow, that's just my venting again. So, yeah, next person, I really enjoyed the segment with Sunuta Lorraine. Yeah, so if people forget this particular session, I'll talk about that for a moment. This was Leonardo DiCaprio's in India, and he's talking to an environmental activist, and she is really taking him to task, saying that, it's time for the U.S. to do something. That's Sunuta Lorraine, and she is, I would call her a famous environmental activist, and certainly well applauded in environmental circles by people like me and I'm not the only one, by the way. So I showed this film in English 22 last term, and it was one of the options. And one of the students got really into Sunuta Lorraine. And I know this because he showed up like every office hour and was talking more and more about her, that he has found videos. And there are lots of different, go to YouTube and put her name in, you'll find lots of different things that she does. And I think people like that are really inspiring activists, and it's not just what they have to say, but just the fact that they're saying it, and that would include people like Greta Thunberg and all. So what was so interesting about her, and let's go back to what's said here, while India as a country is the third biggest polluter behind China and the United States, it's important to note that per capita, one U.S. citizen is equivalent to 34 India citizens when it comes to the carbon footprint. Lorraine makes an extremely good point that the U.S. should be a leader when it comes to using renewable energy. Our country certainly has more financial means to do so, so it's unfair to blame developing countries like India when looking at carbon emissions. Yeah, really well said. Or just to put a finer edge on that even, how did we get so wealthy in the United States? Hold on a second. I have to take a sip because I'm going to go for another rant. The United States, was the leading world economy in the 20th century. And is being, of course, surpassed by China. And with that, of course, came becoming the leading emitter. But that has to be qualified, and we'll talk about that. But just to be clear, per capita emissions, in other words, what the average person in China emits compared to what the average person in the U.S. emits, is much lower, on the order of like a third. And in part, that's because there's so many more people in China. So yes, China as a country is emitting more than the U.S., but remember, it has 4 times as many people. So even though they can be emitting a lot less. And also remember, China is the so-called workshop of the world. What that means is its manufacturing sector is producing an awful lot of emissions for products that are not necessarily or even mostly consumed in China. They're being exported to the world. So in other words, they're sort of housing the world's factories there, and those factories are emitting CO2, but those factories could have been anywhere else. If they didn't have those factories, the way the U.S. doesn't have anywhere near that kind of manufacturing base, then the emissions would be much lower. So if you actually were to compare emissions like per capita, it's even lower if you factor out the manufacturing sector. So anyhow, U.S. was the leading economy for largely the 20th century. Where did the U.S. and where did, in general, the countries of the EU get that wealth? Well, we got it through fossil fuels, the fossil fuel economy. That was our economy for a long time. It's even more worrisome when you go back further, because it's in the U.S. when slavery comes into the picture. And I think we'll talk about that in this class. We need to. But certainly here you can see, in fact, I have a little discussion of that. So you're going to read a chapter from Henry David Thoreau's Walden, who also wrote a work called On Civil Disobedience, or usually called On Civil Disobedience. I have an introduction to that where I talk about how slavery plays into this. Forget that for the moment. Or let's not forget it, but let's set it aside for the moment. Right now, the issue here with the U.S. is we were a fossil fuel economy. That's how we got so powerful. We got so powerful and so wealthy by emitting all this CO2 into the atmosphere. Now we have that wealth, that power, that influence, and we're not doing anything with it. So for us to look at a country like India and say, we're really worried, you have like whatever it is, 1.4 billion people in your country now, and I know you have a lot of coal reserves, so don't burn them because, that would be bad. And it's like, what the hell? I mean, how is it that the U.S. can say that to India when that's exactly what we did? I mean, India, and it's not even like India is trying, making a bid for world domination the way we were, but India rather just wants its people to be living well, and they're not. I mean, hundreds of thousands of people are totally without electricity in that country. So to not look at the role that the U.S. is playing, to just cast our sight out to other countries and to talk about what other countries can do, I mean, it's profoundly hypocritical and problematic. And it's especially problematic because there are people, and a prominent climate activist is Naomi Klein. Naomi Klein wrote a book a few years ago called "This Changes Everything," and the subtitle is pretty much explains what it's about. It's called "Capitalism versus the Climate." And we'll talk about that in film, I think, a little later in a little more detail, or that book, which did become a documentary as well. But in it, what one of the things that Klein talks about is, you've heard about the Green New Deal maybe, and we're going to go into that in detail in this class. But there's something that was proposed before that called the Marshall Plan for the Earth. And what the Marshall Plan was, if you didn't know historically in the U.S., after the Second World War, we had bombed the countries of Europe bad. The countries of Europe were bombed badly, and especially like Germany. Germany in Europe was, incredibly bombed to bring it into the country into submission. What that meant, however, is by the end of the war, that country was devastated. Its industrial sector was devastated. Their economy in Germany had like no chance of rebounding. That concerned people because after the First World War, the economy was devastated in Germany, and that set the stage for the rise of fascism, of Hitler and Nazi Germany. So to avoid that, the U.S. came with a plan called the Marshall Plan, which was to actually finance Germany rebuilding after the war so that they could have a successful economy and a good standard of living for the people there. It wasn't a free lunch. I mean, it was designed to be, paid back and all, but it was extraordinary when you think about it in terms of how mean-spirited politicians can sometimes be today. I won't give any examples, but how that can sometimes happen. But here it was saying, yes, Germany did a horrible, horrible thing, and yet we're going to help Germany. The notion, that was called the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan for the Earth is saying something that's even more sensible. It's not that India did anything horrible to the U.S. or anywhere, but we should, in the same way that we helped Germany and other countries develop, we should help India develop here in the United States. We have a moral obligation to do it. Well, why? Well, because, why wouldn't we want everyone on the planet to be prosperous and happy? Okay, you may not buy that argument. You may say, I'm a big fan of putting borders up and walls and not doing anything outside of the U.S. Well, even if you take that position, an extreme position like that, here's the problem. As they noted in the film, the documentary Before the Flood, India is sitting on a lot of coal. I mean, a lot of coal. And coal is easy to dig, coal is easy to burn, it's cheap to build fossil fuel fired power plants compared to some other things, especially coal-fired ones. If India digs up all that coal and burns it, and that's its route to the future, if it takes the same route to the future that the United States did, which is the fossil fuel route, those emissions, those CO2 and other emissions they will make, will radically increase the climate crisis. So even if everyone in the U.S. were to clean up our act and not do anything, which is not happening, not even beginning, but even if it were to happen, what about India? Well, we can help with that, though. If we help India through something like a Marshall Plan for the Earth, they don't have to burn all that CO2. They can all that coal and make all that CO2. They can instead maybe use solar, and solar would be a thing. And in fact, if you saw the film An Inconvenient Sequel and you weren't quite sure what Al Gore was doing there talking to Solar City, so Solar City, I believe, this is technically right, is still a wholly owned subsidiary of Tesla. It used to be separate, but now it was an Elon Musk company. But Solar City puts solar panels on houses and in buildings and all in the U.S. They're in the solar electric business, and they have some patents for some very highly efficient solar cells. And clearly, if you're going to make solar cells, the more efficient, the better. So what Al Gore was doing in An Inconvenient Sequel is negotiating for India with Solar City to see if Solar City would release those patents to allow India to build for its domestic market for India solar cells using this more efficient technology. And they agreed. The notion here is that's an example, and that's sort of a crossover of the two films, because when Sunita Lorraine says that the U.S. should do something, well, Al Gore, instead of just being a politician, was trying to actually do something, use his position to be able to broker with them, and he did. But it could be more than that. With something like a Marshall Plan for the Earth, we could help in other ways the rest of the world develop. And the thing about this, which is always so great to me with so many of these solutions, is that they are, to my way of thinking, win-win solutions. And what I mean by that is, well, yes, we win because all that CO2 wouldn't be emitted, but the people in the rest of the world win too, because they get to to enter the 21st century as a developed country. And by the way, it's usually these things are not unbeneficial for the U.S. because of and the fact that they may just be loans and all, and that can be a problem with the World Bank and all. So it's a very complicated issue, but I think it's very clear here that the U.S. has an obligation to the world. And at this administration that's now ending, we're in an era of nationalism, of being concerned just about the U.S. and not the rest of the world. But we are intertwined with the world, and we can talk about that in lots of different ways, and I'm sure you know about it from other classes in different ways. But it's not just the world economy is intertwined, but the world atmosphere and environment is intertwined, and oceans are intertwined because of this. So, okay, I think I talked a lot about that particular comment, which was a good one. So, when watching Before the Flood, I went through a range of emotions, from overwhelming and to infuriating and frustrating and sad. Yeah, I drew from the film that we really need to be addressed really needs to be addressed are big corporations and the government. I'm not trying to scapegoat them and only blame them because we as consumers fuel their interests. Corporations and government have a much bigger weight on climate change than myself. Yeah, we just put this here. The actions of big companies, lobbyists, and spineless politicians are criminal. I'm going to just scroll this here so you can see it. Let's get to that point, and then I'll jump back to the secondary point. Well, in that one introductory video, I talked about the relationship between individual action and corporations want to blame us, but on the other hand, they're going to enormous lengths to generate need and desire on our part so that we buy their products and all. But it is absolutely true that corporations and groups of corporations are a problem here. We're actually going to look at a couple industries in some detail by way of the documentaries and with my commentary and all as well. So one will be the fashion industry and so-called fast fashion, and how that impacts the world. And it's not just environmentally, which is a big deal. There's social justice issues, the way people are being exploited across the planet to make our clothes. We're also going to be looking at something like the beef industry and how that industry has the kind of influence it has. And more generally, next week we're going to look at political action, the way that organizations that are fossil fuel affiliates, principally the fossil fuel company, are influencing groups that then directly are charged with influencing the government. So in other words, groups like conservative think tanks like the Heartland and Cato Institute, how they are funneling money into places. And we'll see this with places like Donors Trust, which is a political, it's a donor organization where money can be funneled through there, and it's not clear where the money's coming from, but then it can be given right to individual politicians. So in other words, politicians, say senator or whatever, could say they're getting money from Donors Trust, but they don't know where that money's coming from, and in fact that money would be coming directly from fossil fuel companies and affiliates. But we're going to see that, and that's an important issue here. So again, personal action is good, and we're going to talk a lot about that, and that's always sort of a go-to thing to think about. So when we see fast fashion, you think, well, I could cut down on the kind of stuff that I buy, which is great, but it's a lot more complicated than that. This person makes another great point here, and that is the film being presumably filmed in 2015. That's because it came out in 2016. Also has this optimistic tone toward the Paris Agreement, which was coming out of the end of 2015. That's when the Paris Agreement was like November and then into December. However, it's kind of funny watching this in 2020. When we see that not only has progress not been made, but President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement and painted China as not an ally. Yeah, it's been, this has discredited the sentiment of unity and agreement on climate change, and has also reversed the potential progress that could have been made in the last 4 years. Well, yeah, great observation. So this film, and that's something that's so interesting about the climate crisis, and I know this personally because I really have to pay attention to what's happening because things are changing so quickly. So I've been teaching like English 22 now for 15 years where I cover a lot of this material, and I constantly have to revise it. And a film like this is already becoming dated, as the person rightly noted here, because there was such optimism for a lot of people in 2015. Although, as an aside, I will tell you that, not all of us here at UCSB were as optimistic. So I work a lot with John Foran on a lot of projects. We teach together. We just taught together in the summer. We just taught together in the fall. And John is also a climate activist and actually was at COP21. And took a little contingent of UCSB students with him, and then they came back, and I think this footage is online. The Environmental Humanities Initiative, which I direct, actually did a number of conferences, both before, I guess we did a conference before and a conference after, or a roundtable, where we actually had folks talking about what they had hoped would happen at COP21 and what actually did happen at COP21. And it was interesting because these folks were climate activists, but climate activists were kind of curtailed by the French government at the time because it's complicated, but there had been a bombing beforehand, and there was concern that people out in the streets would be a problem. So, but it was all complicated. But a lot of folks were concerned after COP21, myself included, that what would happen happened, which is kind of nothing. And I don't know that anyone quite saw this administration coming on the scene where we actually would have a climate change denier in the presidency, but there was concern that not enough action would happen, and it didn't. So let's jump to the next comment. Watching Fox News anchors roast Leonardo DiCaprio so viciously just for trying to bring attention to the scientifically proven phenomena of climate change was extremely disheartening. The way that the largest news corporation in America just constantly denies the existence of climate change in the first place sets the tone for how difficult advocating for structural change in the United States is. Yeah. I'll let you read the rest of this here. When Al Gore, when Al Gore initially brought attention to the problem after his failed U.S. presidential run, he was berated and called crazy. I remember watching an episode of South Park where he was viciously made fun of, and then the makers of South Park only to apologize in an episode a decade later, saying that he was right after all. Funny how that happens. Yeah, so that's a good little segue into next week, really. So this week we're going to be talking about the environmental situation because of the climate crisis in California, but then next week, that's week 3, we're going to be talking about climate change denial and how it works. And yes, Fox News is, as far as I know, the largest news corporation network, at least in the U.S. at the moment, and repeatedly they argue that the climate crisis we'll see, there are different flavors of climate change denial. Some people just deny that it's happening outright, that the climate isn't changing. Some people acknowledge that it is, but won't agree that human action is causing it. Some people acknowledge that human action is changing the climate, but not nearly as much as is happening because of natural reasons, and so on and so on and so on. All those are not true, and you've heard the statistic. It's the most well-known and referenced of all articles on the climate crisis, and that is dating from 2011, that 97% of all climate scientists, even back nearly a decade ago, believed that the climate change is happening and being caused by human beings. In fact, that number is even higher than 97%. That doesn't change the fact from the fossil fuel industry and a range of groups in the U.S. from arguing that it's not true. And that is a big problem right now because, if a large swath of Americans, and I'll clarify this as we go along, the tactic there used by deniers is not necessarily to deny that the climate crisis is happening. You might think that would be it, given the name, right? Deniers. But it's not. What the tactic is to raise doubt in the minds of a lot of people. That's why in the films we're watching for week 3, one of them is called Merchants of Doubt and the other is called Climate of Doubt. Why the focus on doubt? Well, if you can get a broad swath of Americans not convinced that the climate's not changing and that we're causing it, but just not quite sure, if you can make the argument, and this is said again and again, you'll hear it, well, the science isn't in yet, it's not conclusive, it's not proven. Well, for a lot of Americans who are just getting by, why would they be willing to spend, trillions of U.S. dollars, and that's what it's going to take, trillions of U.S. dollars to address the climate crisis when this might not even be true? Maybe it's true. I mean, that's the argument. But until we know it's true, we shouldn't act on it. Well, that's a problem. Well, I won't even get into that because we're addressing it later. But know this: it is happening, and this doubt that has been seeded by different. It's all coming out of the fossil fuel industry, but it is being voiced by places like news outlets, Fox News being one, certainly politicians, and even the federal government. But it is definitely happening. But also, it's not like this is actually going to cost us that much. It will in the long run, but it's going to create a whole range of new jobs. Just look at, like, in California, the number of jobs by, installing solar panels and everything in that industry, and wind in other parts of the country. So it's not like it's necessarily going to cost us. It's transitioning into a new economy. It will cost us, but first off, we don't have any choice. But second, it's going to create a new type of economy in the process. So yeah, people like Leonardo DiCaprio, and again, Al Gore, if you stick your head up, you may well catch it here. So let's jump. This person says that the reason the film is so compelling is Leonardo plays the average American, and I think that's right. He is a surrogate for us. He might come with the best intentions, but when faced with the problem that requires him to step outside of the comfort zone, change the American way of life, in exchange for a more sustainable mode of living, he acts resistant and refuses to believe such an option is possible. I found the pairing of the movie with our reading of Uninhabitable Earth to be very effective, as the two balance each other out. Leonardo DiCaprio's solution is a technological one, investing in green energy, building gigafactories, while David Wallace Wells' approach emphasizes the ability of technology, the inability of technology to solve each and every one of the problems. So by the way, I'm looking at the time. I won't go a whole lot longer because I'm aiming this for an hour, and this may well be a good place to end. I addressed this in one of the earlier talks, and I address it also on the landing page for the website, which you should have read. And that is that, there are these different ways of approaching the climate crisis. And Leonardo DiCaprio, and when you watch something like one of these films, you might think, well, everybody's sort of in agreement. It's all sort of the same, approach. but it's not. As much as I like Leonardo DiCaprio's efforts, and as much as I think it's a great film, I'm showing it. It needs to be noted that he does show in the film, evinces an optimism for technology. And the gigafactory that the person is mentioning here is Tesla's gigafactory, which is in Nevada, for building batteries, lithium-ion batteries. And at one point, Elon Musk says, well, if we just build, I think it's 100 of these factories, it would solve the world's problem. And I think it would be so nice if that were true. It would be so nice if you could just do it. First, back to the social justice issues. Go ahead and put in your browser, put in YouTube, lithium mining in parts like the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. It is not clean. It is not nice. Children are in mines, mining dangerous materials so that we can have gigafactories producing these batteries. To say that we can continue to use the amount of resources we have and we can all drive around a Teslas, and again I'll address this issue, it's just unrealistic. It would be so nice if technology could just solve the problem and we'll buy different cars or different whatever and it'll be fine. Yeah, it's not going to work that way. And you'll keep hearing that it is, by the way. And it's not just with like gigafactories. Like a few years ago, a study came out suggesting that we could feed seaweed to cows and then they wouldn't produce as much methane and it wouldn't be as big a problem. But what this suggests is, we don't have to change anything. We can still have our burgers, we can still have our cars, whatever it is we want, we can still have. It is a different story what the Wallace Wells is telling. He is focusing on cultural things, that this is going to have cultural impact, and it's being brought about in part by cultural practices, what we're doing. And that is what this course is about. So if you're of the mind that the technology could solve this and you're a technology person, you might find this class vexing, because we're going to be talking about things like, what kind of burgers we should be eating or what we should be eating, and we're going to be talking about a range of cultural things, some of which may seem odd at first hearing, and I mentioned in previous thing, and I mentioned certainly on the landing page, why something like educating women and girls worldwide is so important, why something like providing access to family planning is so important. These have nothing to do with technology. I mean, we don't need new forms of family planning. We have enough to work. I guess new ones would be better, but these are cultural changes, and we need to realize that we need both of these. Technology is important, but it won't solve the whole thing. And in fact, I would argue, and again, I come at this from humanities approach, which is, human-based approach, that this is largely, a cultural problem that we're facing here. And we're gonna address those as cultural issues. And, think about something like, COVID. COVID's a good example in this regard, and I'll end with this. COVID is in no way a failure of science. COVID is like one of the best examples ever, I would think, of science. What I mean by that is, COVID-19 was identified in early January of 2020. If I'm not mistaken, it was January 8th. I could be wrong. But the very next day, it had already been sequenced. Its DNA had been sequenced in a day. So, I remember an era where the Human Genome Project was taking place during the 1990s, and it took like 13 years, and then finally the human genome was sequenced in the beginning of the aughts, I think 03, at a cost of like $1 billion. So it was incredibly long and incredibly difficult, but that would translate it, by the time we got to 2020, to happening in a day. So that's a triumph of science and technology, because it's technology, the machine that's able to do that sequencing. And then, remarkably, and I forget exactly the exact date, but by the middle of March, the first vaccine had been injected. Now, that wasn't obviously out to the public. That was the beginning of the trials that had to take place. But literally, in just a little over 2 months, scientists, having sequenced the genome, had created a vaccine. That's in no way. I mean, that's mind-boggling and a triumph of science. The problem as far as I'm concerned, and again, you have to understand, I come at this from a cultural, humanities-based thing. The failures here have all been cultural, human, from the individuals refusing to wear a mask to, people in charge, both government and, organizations like the CDC and all. That's where the failure has happened. It's individually, culturally, politically, and that's what we're facing now with the climate crisis, and that's what has to be addressed. It's scientists have pretty much done their job. They've proven beyond any reasonable doubt, as far as I'm concerned, that the climate crisis is happening. And they've offered up some great technological solutions, and they're still working on more, which is great and should be applauded. And I hope they come up with really great ones. But we also have to address that this is a human problem here. That humans are, the way I would argue that humans are kind of the root of the problem. Human actions are responsible for so many difficulties we're experienced during COVID. Well, they're responsible for so many difficulties here because of the climate crisis, what we're doing. It's just something to think about, this notion of how culture is at play here and how it works in a variety of things. And that's another example with COVID. I'm sure if you think about it, you can come up with even more. But it is going to be the focus of this course, and how we address problems here will be as cultural. Again, let me be very clear. In the same way I was just saying, like, I am amazed by scientists. I mean, what they did in developing that identifying, COVID-19 and developing that vaccine so quickly was just breathtaking, brilliant, and I think everyone on the planet owes them a sincere debt of thanks and great admiration. But on the other hand, they cannot do this alone, and for us to think that they're going to solve the climate crisis alone, that this is going to be done just through technology, is asking far too much of them and asking far too little of us. Each of us and every other institution that works for us and that is fed by us. Okay, I'll end it there. So I'll see you next time. I hope you have a good week, and I'll give you the next installment a week from today or a week from yesterday.